Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for this week's webinar. My name's Roberto King, CTO at Foster & Freeman. Today we're going to be talking about infrared fluorescent fingerprint powders for the high contrast visualization of latent finger marks. Before we start, as usual, to go through some housekeeping procedures. To simplify the proceedings, all of our guests' microphones will be muted throughout the webinar. But please feel free to use the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can at the end of the session today. So in terms of Fingermark enhancement and Fingermark investigation, crime scene examiners, forensic laboratory technicians will typically use numerous methods to develop latent finger marks. But perhaps the most synonymous Fingermark enhancement method is that of fingerprint powder dusting. Dusting for latent finger marks works through the adhesion of fine particulate matter to the fingermark residues that reside on typically non-porous surfaces. A fine layer of dust, which is the Fingermark enhancement powder itself, clings to the fingermark residue, allowing it to be visualized and typically photographed in situ or lifted with a sticky tape or a gel lifter for examination and photography. We can change the colour of the fingermark powder to provide contrast with the background surface to which the fingermark resides. We can also introduce a fluorescent dye to the fingermark powder and examine with a narrowband forensic light source to eliminate background interference. But sometimes even a very good quality fingerprint can disappear into the background. In 2014, given the imminent introduction of polymer banknote currency in the UK, Foster & Freeman set out to develop a new fingerprint powder that would help eliminate background interference and enhance the visibility of finger marks on these non-porous substrate types. In order to do this, our research took us beyond the visible spectrum and into the near infrared, that is between 700 and 1000 nanometers. In this part of the spectrum, colours and textures which we're used to seeing in day-to-day life with the visible eye often disappear and become monochrome. Certain substances, such as trees, plant matter, grasses, emit natural infrared fluorescence. And some inks and printed materials drop out or become transmissive to infrared radiation and disappear. As mentioned previously, nature actually proved to be a source of inspiration for the development of our very first infrared fluorescent fingerprint powder, fpNatural 1. fpNatural 1 is a green IR fluorescent fingerprint powder that was developed from algae-based material and cyanophyta, and it becomes our original infrared fluorescent fingerprint powder. fpNatural 1 fluoresces in the near IR region of the spectrum, typically from about 700 to 780, 800 nanometers. It allows us to suppress background fluorescence, which typically occurs in the visible part of the spectrum. It's a low-cost powder, and it's safe and easy to use. As its name suggests, it's natural in composition, meaning that it's very low health and safety issues associated with using the powder, apart from, obviously, the fine particulate dust which it produces. We've proven that fpNatural 1 is capable of providing excellent results on many substrate types. The example shown on the screen here is an Australian $10 polymer banknote viewed in the visible part of the spectrum, dusted with fpNatural 1, illuminated with either blue or red light, and the fluorescence occurs from 715 nanometers onwards. And we can see that the background is effectively quenched, and we get strong fluorescence where the latent finger marks are. In 2015, we published a manuscript outlining the benefits of fpNatural 1 in Forensic Science International, manuscript title, Seeing into the Infrared, a novel infrared fluorescent fingerprint powder. We continued our development with infrared fluorescence over the preceding couple of years, and we set out to develop a second fpNatural infrared fluorescent fingerprint powder that would further reduce background interference and further enhance the visibility of fingerprints. But how we were going to do this at the time wasn't immediately clear, and our research led us to near-infrared fluorescent imaging, or NIRF imaging. Now, near-infrared fluorescence is a relatively new technique, but it's more commonly used in clinical studies, biomedical science, for live cell imaging. It's subject to wide research of late due to a number of advantages that it has over ultraviolet and visible imaging. In biomedical science, we often encounter natural autofluorescence from biological components within the body. So the example here of the mouse dissection, under white light we can see all of the internal organs. Under green light we can see that we have natural autofluorescence from the digestive tract, and under blue light this is exacerbated even further. However, on the right hand side of the screen you can see the image which results from near-infrared illumination, and we can see that there is no autofluorescence in the near-IR image. Accordingly, if we introduce an infrared fluorescent dye, but something which can be excited in the infrared part of the spectrum and exhibit its fluorescence further into the near-infrared, then we can overcome the issues with the competing background fluorescence which we would see in the visible part of the spectrum, as shown previously. In this example, IR dye, which is an indocyanine green dye material, is injected into the body, and over the period of 24 hours, with near-infrared illumination, the location of the tumour can be highlighted in the mouse. Accordingly, we end up with a situation where we have no background fluorescence or no inherent autofluorescence, but excellent contrast from the IR dye uptake within the tumour site itself. So the advantages of near-infrared fluorescence are quite clear, but why hasn't it been looked at before? Well, the main reason for this is because near-infrared fluorescence technology has been prohibitively expensive. Commercially available IR dye, things like indocyanine green, typically cost between £100 and £1,000 per 10 milligrams. And of course 10 milligrams doesn't go very far when we're considering the enhancement or potentially the fingerprint dusting of latent finger marks. The other issues with commercially available near-infrared fluorescent dyes is that they have toxicity issues associated with them. And so when considering them for use within a forensic laboratory, this is something that we want to avoid. So on one side, we have the need to improve our ability to develop latent finger marks. And on the other side, we have a technique which is potentially viable, but is very expensive in its current form and has toxicity issues associated with it. However, in between that is fpNatural 2. fpNatural 2 opens up a new genre of fingermark visualization. It's a natural progression from fpNatural 1. It improves on fpNatural 1 in so much as it fluoresces at a longer wavelength, which allows us to better suppress the backgrounds. fpNatural 2 typically exhibits fluorescence from about 700 nanometers right through to 1000 nanometers. Importantly, fpNatural 2 can also be excited in the near-infrared part of the spectrum itself. So we use a 780 nanometer narrowband light source to induce the fluorescence of fpNatural 2, and we observe that fluorescent output from about 850 nanometers onwards. Similarly to fpNatural 1, it's non-toxic, it's safe, and it's easy to use. To give you a little bit of background into fpNatural 2, it's actually derived from an ancient pigment, Egyptian blue, which is a mineral-based material comprising of calcium copper silicate and also known as cuprorivate. Egyptian blue is essentially a mixture of silica, lime, copper and an alkali material, and it's actually the first known synthetic pigment. In its native state, it exists as a bright blue powder, and it has an extremely high fluorescence quantum yield. And quantum yield is a term that we give for the efficiency of a material to take the light which is shone onto it and exhibit that as fluorescence. So typically most of the Fingermark enhancement chemicals that you will use in a laboratory that exhibit some form of fluorescence have a quantum yield of about 1 to 2%. fpNatural 2's quantum yield is about 10%. The excitation emission spectra shown on the screen here shows the absorption profile and subsequent fluorescent emission of fpNatural 2. As you can see on the dotted line, which is the absorption spectra, there are two main peaks. One that peaks at about 650 nanometers, which is in the red part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and importantly, a secondary peak at 780 nanometers in the near infrared. Exciting fpNatural 2 across this part of the electromagnetic spectrum causes the fluorescent emission from 800 nanometers to just over 1000 nanometers. This means that the material can be excited with a white light, a red light source, or, in the favoured case, our near-infrared 780 nanometer light source to induce the infrared fluorescence. To compare the two powders side by side, fpNatural 1 is green in appearance and fpNatural 2 is blue. fpNatural 1 can be excited in the blue part of the spectrum, so 420 to 470 nanometers, and the red part of the spectrum, 600 to 660 nanometers. fpNatural 2, as I mentioned, can be excited using white light, our red light source, or our near-infrared light source. The fluorescent emission profiles of both powders are shown on the screen. So fpNatural 1 typically exhibits fluorescence from 700 nanometers with a peak up to about 800 nanometers. fpNatural 2 from 800 nanometers through to about 1000 nanometers. We're now going to have a look at a polymer banknote examination in real time.
So to demonstrate the infrared fluorescence, the sample that I'll first look at is this drinks can. So a very common and familiar item. And again, this would be a classic item that would be processed with superglue. So this item has in fact been processed with superglue, but then we have applied fpNatural 1 on top of that. So that also demonstrates that the natural powders can be used subsequently after previous treatments or straight away on latent marks, as would be with any other powders. So we'll have a look at this first with the Chromler 8x4 and see the results. So for fpNatural 1, we can either use the blue light or red as the excitation source. So we'll start with blue. And again, because this is a non-visible technique, we will have to use the live mode within the camera. So this demonstrates that we can see some fingerprints, although the fluorescence is a little bit weaker. But we are also getting interruption from the background, particularly the Coca-Cola logo here. If I switch to the red light, you can see immediately the benefits of these Natural 1 powders. So in this example, the background has been almost removed entirely, and we're getting much stronger fluorescence from the fingerprint. And here I will take a preview and enlarge this particular print here, and again we can see the amount of detail that we can see. So easily first, second, and in some places third level ridge detail as well. Another example is this polymer banknote, and this will demonstrate the primary reason why the fpNatural powders were developed, and that was when the introduction of polymer banknotes in the UK. So here I have just a sample polymer banknote, and this has been developed with fpNatural 2. The primary reason for Natural 2 over Natural 1 is generally we find we get a lot less background fluorescence, principally because our excitation light is infrared. And many of the security features, particularly on banknotes, but also on packaging, they generally do not fluoresce or fluoresce to a much less extent. So we're able to get much better contrast between the background and the fingerprint. With fpNatural 2, our excitation light can either be red or infrared. So primarily we will be using the infrared, but because the fluorescence is quite a bit weaker in some cases, the fingerprints are much more visible in red. So we can sometimes locate our fingerprints using the red and then switch to the infrared when we know we've got good fingerprints and good focus on our sample. And for Natural 2, we will also be using these black labeled sharp cut filters on the 8x4 Mark IV. So we'll first start out by looking at the sample using the red light as our excitation. And here we can clearly see a number of fingerprints on this sample, but we also have a lot of background fluorescence, so particularly these whiter areas here and some of our background text and printing. So I'll just take a preview of this so we can compare against the infrared light in a moment. So I'll return to live mode. And now, with the same filter on the crime light, simply switch to the infrared light source. And you can visibly see already that the fluorescence is much weaker. And as I start to increase the shutter speed, we do get a lot more noise in our live mode, but that noise is only present in our live mode. And as soon as we take a preview, you'll see that we get a much cleaner image. And we should find that our background fluorescence has almost completely disappeared in most areas. And we are, in most cases, just seeing the fluorescence from the fingerprint. And for comparison, this is the result using the red light as our excitation, and this is our infrared. So we can clearly see how significantly we've reduced the effects of the background fluorescence by using infrared light as our excitation.
As I mentioned previously, one of the main drivers behind this research and the development of these two fpNatural powders was the introduction of polymer currency, polymer banknotes within the UK. And of course, other countries around the world have been using polymer banknotes for a number of years now. But it was something new to the UK and a substrate which is inherently difficult to obtain good quality latent finger marks from. The reason for this is when you actually look at the banknotes themselves, in the visible part of the spectrum, they have an abundance of security features and complex background patterns, which actually detract from the clarity of the fingerprint ridge flow that may be developed on their surface.
The new plastic fiver has just gone into circulation, and already innovative ways of catching criminals who come into contact with the plastic notes are under development. A forensic equipment firm in Midlands has created new technology that can pull fingerprints from the notes. Here's Joan Cummins.
400 million new polymer £5 notes have been printed by the Bank of England. They're cleaner, stronger and harder to counterfeit. But does their durability make them harder to forensically examine?
Joan, this is one of the new £5 notes from the Bank of England.
It's really nice. I better give it back before I'm accused.
Yeah, please, that would be great.
Roberto King has been experimenting with a secret stash of polymer fivers for 18 months. He's a scientist who develops forensic equipment.
The way that the technology really works is that we can then shine a high intensity light onto the surface. So we use an infrared light and that then illuminates the powder and causes it to fluoresce or glow in the infrared part of the spectrum.
More than 20 countries across the world already use plastic notes and have developed their own systems. But the Evesham firm think they're the first in the world to use infrared in fingerprint analysis.
Fingerprint technology is limited at the moment really to the visible part of the spectrum, and this really gives it another angle, and found it really surprising how well it works.
The firm won't say who their customers are, but admit that 90% of their equipment is sold overseas. Already the technology is being considered for the intelligence industry. Because science is always evolving, this latest technology used for fingerprinting could also be used by covert operations, because basically it's invisible to the naked eye. Joan Cummins, BBC Midlands Today, Evesham.
The use of near-infrared fluorescence and the fpNatural powders isn't purely limited to patterned or inherently fluorescent backgrounds and surfaces. They also have great benefits on being used on materials which are highly reflective or polished in appearance. When we look at these types of surfaces, we often encounter reflections in the visible part of the spectrum. And to some extent, we can use cross-polarization to reduce these reflections. But in many instances, and certainly the instance shown on the screen here, it's almost impossible to remove these reflections from the image in the visible part of the spectrum. However, when we look at things in the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum, these reflections disappear. So here we see a latent finger mark treated with fpNatural 2, illuminated at 780 nanometers, and the fluorescence from 850 nanometers onwards. And we can see that that reflection, which was running across the image, has disappeared, and all we see is a high quality latent finger mark. Again, one of the things that we're very proud of at Foster & Freeman is our research capacity and the fact that we want to publish a lot of the work that we do in order to share that with the forensic community, and it helps us underpin a lot of the product development and the products which we sell and can be used by end users such as yourselves within the laboratory. So we published another paper in Forensic Science International, near infrared to near infrared fluorescence, a new genre of Fingermark visualization techniques. And this outlines the development of what went on to be called fpNatural 2, with some examples to show the benefits of imaging in this way. So the benefits of fpNatural 2 are hopefully quite clear. It's the first time that near infrared fluorescence has been used within fingerprint forensics. But we've managed to do it in a very low cost and easy to use fashion. We can use the material in both the daylight and the darkness, and it fluoresces in the near infrared part of the spectrum, which allows us to suppress the background fluorescence using this extremely high quantum yield. And we've shown excellent results on a wide range of substrates, and we have end users across the world using this technique and these powders on casework to success. Hope that you've enjoyed the content of today's webinar. I appreciate that there's quite a lot of technical aspects to these infrared powders and their use and their application. But if you have any questions, then please feel free to ask them in the chat box now, and we'll start looking through them and answering them as quickly as possible. Thanks again.